Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we will speak about automation of domestic work. This episode is part of our series dedicated to the Bruegel project on the future of work and inclusive growth. I'm happy to welcome Ekaterina Hertog, who is Associate Professor in AI and Society at the Oxford Internet Institute. Hi, Ekaterina. How are you?
Hello. I'm fine. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm also happy to have with us Fabian Stefani, who is non-resident fellow here at Bruegel and working on our project on the future of work, as well as associated with the Oxford Internet Institute. Hi, Fabian.
Hi, Giuseppe. Thanks for having me.
So the future of work has become a prominent topic for research and policy debate, as we have seen in our previous episodes and the research we have dedicated to this topic. However, the debate has focused entirely or almost entirely on paid work, even though people in industrialized countries on average spend comparable amounts of time on unpaid work. Frances Gabe once said, "Housework is a thankless, unending job. A nerve-tangling bore. Who wants it? Nobody." With my jaw set hard, I was determined that there had to be a better way. And Frances Gabe was driven by her hatred of house cleaning to develop one of the most radical and yet practical inventions of all time, the self-cleaning house. She eventually not only built it and patented it back in 1984, but she also lived in it. And to date, that has been the only self-cleaning house built so far. Ekaterina, you lead a domestic AI project at the Oxford Internet Institute, and you and your team are scoping new technologies potential to free up time now locked into unpaid domestic labor and you're measuring how willing people are to introduce these technologies into their private lives. And I see many interesting angles and questions to this research, which link up to our broader exploration about the future of work and inclusiveness. There is a work-life balance aspect. There is the question of services oriented towards the domestic work market. There is a gender question and much more. So let's start with the general methodological question. So why research on application of automation to services and manufacturing has been booming, and the forecasts about its positive or negative impact on the job market multiplied in the past decade or so, little attention has been paid for the work done inside households. What has been your motivation to start this research project?
The motivation has been exactly sort of what you pointed out, this big, what looks like a big gap in the research interests. So much attention paid to paid work, but the amount of time we spend in our lives on unpaid work is comparable. Societies cannot function without children being raised, elderly or ill people being taken care of, just meals being cooked. And yet, what's the future? Will the AI and robots transform it or not? This is the question we wanted to ask. And we wanted to get a better sense of how the modern technologies may or may not transform our homes.
Thank you. Fabian, I'm looking at you as well because you've been working also on the other side, which is like more the paid work side of the story. How do you see the need for such a research on domestic automation?
As you said, Giuseppe, we spend a considerable amount of time. Katja and her colleagues, they mentioned this at the very beginning of the first publication on this project, that I think on average, individuals, please, Katja, correct me if I'm wrong, that actually the majority of our time goes into daily tasks that are unpaid. So when we think about these things, not everything that should be measured is measured in that sense. A lot of the productivity, a lot of the time and resources goes into things that are economically not measured. But it's super relevant because they do play an important role in our lives. And so it's also important for us to see how they are affected by technology in particular. And just to segue a little bit more into this research in particular, when it comes to the division of work between genders, because I think that's one of the really fascinating insights of this research project is that work is, as we know, unevenly distributed between men and women. But when we look at the division again between paid work and unpaid work, there's very strong evidence. So it's very, very clear that much of this unpaid work is done by women. And the interesting thing is, how does it change with technology?
Well, we're going to get more into the gender gap and the gender perspective on this in a moment. But I would like to ask Katerina, what has been your methodological approach? Because I imagine you had to build up something new for this new field of research.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, just to kind of roll back a little bit, I think thinking in economic terms, there's a supply and demand issue to this question. So there is a question, which kind of technologies might come on stream? Are there going to be robots that can take out our rubbish, raise our children, and so on? And then there's a second question, will there be demand for these technologies? Do we actually want, even if the robots become possible, do we actually want to introduce them into our daily lives? Because of these two sides to the question, my project, exactly, there were two main methodologies that I relied upon. One is a fairly standard or well-respected forecasting methodology, a Delphi survey that we served to a number of experts working in the field of computer sciences, machine learning, computer vision, and so on and so forth, engineering as well, asking them what do they think, which kind of domestic tasks and to which extent could be automated in the next 5 and 10 years' time. So this was a Delphi survey forecasting methodology. And then to get a sense of a demand side to it, we've served a vignette survey. A vignette survey is a survey which has a story, a fictitious scenario that the respondents are asked to imagine, like, you've come home, you now need to cook. You've worked 8 hours, you've earned so much per hour. Your partner typically on a daily basis works only 4 hours, and you now need to cook. Would you like to do it yourself? Would you ask your partner to do it? Would you like to use a robot for that? Or perhaps you would like to hire human help. So this is a kind of scenario we asked our respondents to think about. And was a way that we captured demand for these technologies and sort of alternatives ways of getting some kind of domestic work done.
And what did you find out? I mean, like, what kind of tasks are more likely to be automated? Going beyond our, there's a Roomba vacuum cleaner, which probably a lot of us have at home, or something that is already a little bit more sophisticated, like an intelligent washing machine that could optimize timing, consumption of energy and soap to our needs. Or there can be like more science fiction-y kind of ideas or images that you might have find out, or something more trivial. What exactly these people have been telling you?
So first, looking at the supply side of things, unfortunately, as this field moves so fast, my expert survey was carried out in late 2021. So, for example, one of the things to note that was pre-ChatGPT. I mean, ChatGPT existed, but it hasn't exploded our imaginations back then. So at that time, very broadly speaking, I think there were two main findings from the expert survey. One is that all domestic tasks that we asked about, care tasks and housework tasks, were seen as automatable to some extent. There was a broad pattern in that experts felt that housework tasks, especially stuff that's very repetitive, like grocery shopping, we tend to buy kind of similar things week in, week out, floor cleaning, dishwashing, cooking as well, were seen as much more automatable, that in 5 years' time, even though we already have technologies like dishwashers and online shopping algorithms, but experts thought that there could be a lot more time savings on top of that. Care work was seen as less automatable, and that actually was in line with the literature that Fabian knows even better than me on paid work automation, which tended to say that tasks that involve human interaction and depend on human communications in paid work are harder to automate. And we seem to see the same pattern in unpaid work, like teaching a child, playing with a child, caring for an older adult was seen as less automatable compared to a variety of housework tasks.
Fabian, there are some of the tasks that Ekaterina just mentioned, which are really on the frontier between the paid and the unpaid, in the sense that they have an effect on, Ekaterina spoke about grocery shopping or all the stuff. So there's one side that goes on the unpaid work side, but the other side is that this is actually something that implies an automation of actual paid work at the moment, right? I mean, like, how do you see this frontier between the domestic work automation and the paid work automation? It seems to me that there is something more to say over there.
Absolutely. I think and that's one of the really fascinating things, that's why this ecosystem or this specific domain of privacy, because this frontier that you just mentioned, from my point of view, is fractured, because Katja already said this at the beginning. For things to be automated, and that is something I think economists can really agree on, there are essentially at least 2, if not 3 steps. So it needs to be technologically proficient. So the machine or the algorithm needs to be proficient, let's say at least at the same quality as a human being. Then it needs to be economically efficient. So even if it's the same quality, but it takes much longer, it's extremely costly to build this machine, you can't do it at scale, it's not going to be automated, because then a human being is still economically more efficient. It's like one of the reasons, if we come into a hotel room, we might meet a maid, we might meet a person still cleaning this room. It's not full of robots. I think part of the explanation is because the human labor is still cheaper on average throughout the entire supply chain than putting a robot in there. And lastly, it needs to be ethically acceptable. So even if the 2 steps are fulfilled, we might still say, like, okay, but do we want our children to be raised by robots, or elderly to be taken care of by robots, for example? And the interesting thing is, what I mean with fractured, this frontier between paid work and unpaid work, is that here the economic perspective, for obvious reasons, is not that prominent. At least I would say that, because the economic rationale of, let's say, supply and demand and market efficiency applies to a smaller extent, because it's unpaid work. People don't have to justify it, to a certain extent, at least, to be cost efficient in what they do. And so I think that's interesting, because then I would conclude, when it comes to whether something is automatable in the domestic domain, it's more about more focus has been put on the other 2 aspects, on the technological proficiency, but more specifically on the ethical acceptability. And I think that is something that is clear if you look at the different tasks and the different types of work that are done, because those are very often things, taking care of children, for example, or taking care of elderly, doing care work. These are often things where you immediately think, like, okay, do we really want this? Is that something that we think is acceptable for our society?
Yeah, indeed. And Ekaterina, you've been also looking at especially this issue of care work, if I'm correct, that Fabian's just mentioning.
I have to jump in and slightly disagree with Fabian.
That's good.
I'm thinking about your first sort of the economic argument to it. And you're right, when it comes to unpaid work, it's less visible. But to me, it's always like the issue of opportunity costs looms very large. So while there is not a specific cost, right? I mean, if I'm cleaning the floor, no one's paying me. My husband's not paying me for it yet. And therefore, it seems to come completely for free. But yet, I'm not doing something else. I'm not spending my time, potentially building up my human capital and becoming an even more productive worker in the paid labor market. In some cases, women quit their jobs completely, and there is big debates in sociology, at least, and I think in economics as well, about the loss of talent, of female talent, especially in the very gender unequal societies like Japan, for example, where women all women go to university almost on par with men. There's still fewer women going up to university than men, but they're catching up, and there's not many fewer. There's a couple percentage point difference, and yet all that talent is lost as many women quit their jobs when they have children, because the combined workload becomes just unmanageable. So this is my slight disagreement. I think as societies, we might want to kind of pay more attention to this point, that unpaid domestic work comes at a price. There's sometimes the price is hidden because it's an opportunity cost, it's wages lost or talent, that left the labor market. But I also agree with Fabian in that how large the ethical component when it comes to automation, the ethical questions loom when it comes to automation of domestic work, and again, especially care work. So I'm happy to chat about that as well. So one of the things I would say, looking at both my supply side and demand side, and I have to make a small caveat, while I've carried out my expert survey in 2021, we've got a paper published out of it, it's went through a standard review process. So this is a well sort of polished research. I've just completed the data collection for my demand side for respondents. So this is very much work in progress. My findings might somewhat change. So with that caveat, what we're finding now that people are not blind in a way to these ethical concerns, and at least in the UK, we are finding that there is not a huge appetite to outsource huge amounts of domestic work to robots to just fill in our homes with robots. And in particular, people seem to have reservations about automating care work. So people seem more comfortable with getting robots. I mean, again, perhaps we're familiar with this, Roombas and so on, to help with cleaning, cooking, and shopping, and less comfortable with robotic nannies looking after children.
You mentioned these differences also between countries. You mentioned Japan, and there is an intersectionality between the geography and the gender, for example. You mentioned Japan as an example. What else did you find that diverged with other regions of the world in your survey?
So my project at the moment, this particular is largely focused on UK and Japan. So the data is collected in these two countries. I do have another paper that relies on Eurobarometer survey, which covers 28 European countries and has a couple of questions asking about people's willingness to use robots in elder care and to use robots or drones in receiving deliveries. Would you be comfortable if your delivery was received with a robot or a drone? And that gives me a bit more of an insight about, other regions, at least within Europe. And what we see there is, for example, when it comes to acceptability of using robots in elder care, there seems to be some variation depending on the level of local generosity in welfare provision. So that's relies on the survey, and all we can say is associations rather than causation. I wouldn't make a strong claim about causal relationship, but at least in places where welfare provision for the elderly measured by, for example, cash benefits, availability of doctors, and so on, is generous, people are less keen on using technology in that space, whereas where, by at least thinking that we're located within Europe, it's less generous. People are more keen. And our hypothesis with my co-authors was that, well, maybe it's when you've got, there's a comfortable system to provide elderly care in a given society. You quite like maybe receiving care from humans. And if there is individuals feel this provision is enough, substantial, they don't want to bring in new technologies, at least in the care space. But when it's short and people think about shortages of robots and lower benefits, lack of availability of social workers, then they're more open to seeing technology as sort of as a stopgap, or perhaps something that maybe is less desirable than human help, but more desirable than nothing.
Fabian, do you have any comments on that?
I really love this cross-sectional perspective, looking at societies that have not only a very different perspective towards technology, in particular this type of technology, because I think what is fascinating is, I hope that we would manage to have this talk without mentioning ChatGPT. We mentioned it once at the beginning, but I think we're not going to talk about this a lot in this talk, because we're talking about a different type of technology, interestingly. I mean, not surprisingly, because domestic work is a lot of manual and physical work. Predominantly, I guess.
It's less about language processing and it's more about food processing and physical processing.
Exactly. So we talk about drones, we talk about robots a lot, for example, and in the Japanese perspective, I think, even though I've unfortunately yet to visit Japan, but my understanding, talking to colleagues from there and friends, is that the society has been more exposed to robots. So robots are already taking a larger part in their life, or more prominent role in their lives, and therefore I would say, at least if I remember the study results correctly, Katja, is that they are also, on average, more open to outsourcing, to giving these tasks to robots. And at the same time, they have yet again a completely different, in terms to compared to the UK, for example, perspective on gender roles as well. Because I also, and again, I'm a lack of knowledge here, have a more conservative perspective on average when it comes to the division of how labor should be divided between men and women. And I'm curious on how this interplay played out in the study, in the final results.
Ekaterina, do you want to?
I'd love to jump in. Thanks, Fabian. So there was actually really interesting and slightly contradictory findings between the two sides of our investigation. So is known Japan is a very gender unequal society. And some of my research shows, for example, that women still do 90% of all care work and housework within the couples. For example, to give you a comparison with the UK, in the UK, I think women do around 60%. So both are unequal, but Japan is very unequal. And in the expert survey, we compared predictions made by male and female experts. And one of the interesting gender dynamics we found there is while what we saw in the UK is what we generally expected to see. Male experts were more optimistic about technology. That's a general pattern that's repeated from survey after survey. Men tend to feel more skillful, more optimistic about technology, and believe more strongly in their capabilities. In Japan, the dynamic was reversed. Japanese women made predictions about the capabilities of the future domestic robots, very similar to UK women. Japanese men were extremely pessimistic, and where essentially they felt that this doesn't have that much of a future. And when we tried to unpack and poke into that a little bit, we noticed that looking at male and female experts, zooming in and focusing on male and female experts in Japan, they started rather similarly, saying, well, domestic work is quite complex. Think, for example, about cooking. It's multiple little tasks. There's chopping, there's washing, there's finding a recipe, and so on and so forth. These are complex tasks. It might be fairly costly to automate. And there, Japanese men and women were the same. And then men continued and said, well, it will be so expensive. No one's going to buy it. Whereas women said, it'll be rather expensive. I really need it. And it would be super helpful. So we felt that perhaps some of the lived experiences with women who were likely heavily involved in domestic work, and these were experts, these were at the same time women with major careers. So managing work and family balance probably was a significant issue for them, compared to men who might have been less exposed to these sorts of tasks, and just these tasks were happening in the background, and maybe they felt less used to for having new technologies to help with them. When it comes to the demand side, this is again very preliminary, but we did have two surveys, one run in the UK and one in Japan, and very initial findings is that Japanese consumers were more open to these technologies than the UK ones. So Japanese consumers did feel more optimistic and more open, perhaps from the fact that technology is more present. There's been also a very strong narrative and sort of government message that the Japanese society is aging very rapidly. And it's kind of drilled down to everyone that there will be not enough adults to take care of the elderly and the children, and particularly the elderly, because there's just ever more elderly per one working age adult. And so from the consumer perspective, the Japanese seem to be more open to adopting these technologies and bringing them into their homes.
That's really fascinating. If I may jump in, Giuseppe, because Katia, what I'm imagining, I'm thinking about our society is evolving, and so are the perceptions of what is typical, or whether housework or care work is a typical female work or male work. And in some societies, I think, I don't know, probably Scandinavian countries, I'm assuming, we might be coming closer to parity, so that there is no typical male or female work anymore. While others, and I'm suggesting from what you said, might suggest that countries like Japan, where there is still a relatively strong division. And now the technology comes in, and I'm wondering how this is going to go. Is it maybe that at some point domestic work will not be done by humans anymore, while some countries, for them on the way, men and women share it, and in other countries, men never ever participated, I mean, at a full scale in domestic work, but just the robots are coming in. Do you see these two trajectories? Kind of.
Well, I understand. I think leapfrogging is often used in a sort of, maybe even a positive way, where you have more.
I mean, for men, it would be though.
No, but I mean, like, you understand in what sense? Like, when you use like technology, you use a lot like when there was like
Absolutely.
adoption of mobile phones in Africa, and they were like very back in the 90s, in 2000s, where
Banking,
like landlines were not so developed, and then they leapfrogged with connectivity with the introduction of mobile phones. So I would use leapfrogging on that sense, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, we would skip the phase of man doing 50% of the domestic work and go immediately to the robot. But is it really, Katja? Do you think?
I mean, my vision of the future is more like going to 50-50, but perhaps everyone's overall load is rather small, and robots are doing the repetitive and the boring ones.
So maybe 30-30, and the other 40% are done by robots.
Perhaps. But then there's also, we need to have, I mean, this is the sort of thing I always also raise, and coming back to the ethical side of it is, which I think there's also a debate to be had about what do we want to outsource. I mean, maybe there is now a brilliant robot. I mean, to be honest, if we're absolutely honest with ourselves, there is technology now that can take over childcare pretty completely. I mean, anyone who has a child, perhaps age over 3, you give them an iPad and you'll never see them again. As long as you don't try to wrestle it back. So theoretically, we could have our children cared for with the help of iPads.
It's not necessarily what you want for the upbringing and education of your kid. But there is another aspect, Ekaterina. Sorry to interrupt you on those broader ethical considerations, which is the issue of privacy, which we haven't touched upon yet, but it is a big topic when it comes to automation of your household. Data collection linked to the Internet of Things is one of the stuff which can make people frown upon when buying a smart fridge, or, like as we know with Amazon, Alexa, Apple Siri, and so forth. I mean, without going into the details of each of the brands and so forth. But, there is a clear issue over there, right? Also, privacy and also security breaches and so on. Like, the two things goes on pair, right?
They do. I mean, I think to me, to some extent, I think the problem is regulatory as well. I think we do have solution to a number of these issues. And as you say, domestic work tends to happen in the home. Many of the tasks have to be. Some of the tasks, like laundry, can be taken away, but most of it will be happen in-house. Your floor cannot be cleaned outside your home, for example. That's why automating domestic space also raises particular concerns and particular risks in terms of privacy loss. It's a private space where we are also not used to guarding our privacy. We sort of tend to naturally think we shut our front door and we're at home and no one's watching us. But potentially these devices now can watch us. At the same time, as I said, I think some of these issues might be more regulatory. There are some solutions to them. For example, I often think about automating cooking. If there is a very skillful cooking robot, it will need to know a fair amount about family members, any allergies, food intolerances, potential inferences about age, at least, very young children and possibly very old people, or with people with certain health conditions would have particular diets, possibly, knowledge about allergies and so on. This is quite private and information we typically would guard as, medically relevant. There are solutions like ensuring this is kept on the device, for example, that this information, why does this robot need to communicate it necessarily back to the mothership? I'm not quite sure. So I think there is no avoidance of the fact that the domestic robot for many domestic jobs, maybe not all, but many, would need to learn about a specific household, a lot about a specific household. But I'm not sure that it necessarily needs to communicate that information outside the household, or whether we can't have regulation, at least for some of it, to reduce this risk substantially. And I think this is at least needs to be now discussed further and debated if these technologies become more prevalent before they get adopted at scale.
Unless the cooking robot needs to communicate to the drone that needs to go to the instead of the supermarket, whatever replaces the supermarket of the future, which is like the hub for the ingredients, which is then delivered into the house, right?
There is that.
The whole ecosystem that is that requires sharing information and data.
Yeah, but I absolutely agree with Katja. We've been a co-author of this study, Lulu, she, and I. We're looking at automation, the skills and tasks that can be automated in edtech, so education, which is to a certain extent, I think, part of domestic work when it comes to preschool education, playing with kids. And here, this similar thing arises. The thing is, there are clearly advantages of data, of user data, being curated by algorithms and being compared and extrapolated by machine learning, for example, to say like, hey, you are, our algorithm tells us that based on the massive amounts of data that we use for training, that you should be improving this specific element, or you should be repeating that specific exercise to make progress. I think we all come to understand that, but I think we shouldn't take for granted that, as you said, that for this purpose, the data needs to be played back to the mothership. Because if we look at some of the education apps, we do see different approaches. We see the approach that your data remains on your device in your home, but the inference is being made with anonymized data in the mothership, but the recommendations are being played back to you. So there's no need for your specific data, for your specific information to leave the house. But of course, that's... I think that's the more this technology is entering the domestic space, that's a huge issue for clarifying this and putting this also cementing this into regulation.
Exactly, and at least not starting from the point. I think it sometimes we intend or inclined to start from the point that let's give them a lot of data and they'll produce a useful product eventually. And I think this is not the approach we would like to take with domestic technology. And perhaps if there's a very strong case to be made and like a very clear benefits, we've got this technology, it would only work if you communicate this amount of information. Maybe then we say yes, but it's not. At the moment, I think sometimes it's let's give all the information. I mean, there was a recent case or a bit of a scandal with Roomba where it was collecting visual information, taking photos or camera feed from the homes. And I don't understand why my vacuum cleaner needs to film my home and how it improves the vacuum. And it wasn't filming the floor, it was filming upwards. I don't see how it benefits me as a consumer. And I think a case has to be made before that's allowed.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like this kind of data scarcity mindset needs to be established a bit more in the sense like we should flip the justification mechanism around. Like the companies and providers have to tell me why they specifically need this data in order to improve services, not the other way around. Collect everything and say like, okay, we with whatever we got from you, we'll try to provide the service a service that is good enough. Yeah,
absolutely. And this brings basically and partially already answered my last question, because we are going towards the end of this episode, which is about the policy recommendations, and this issue of regulation on data is definitely a hot topic and something that we just touched upon. But I wonder, going back to the study that you've done, Ekaterina, if there were other policy recommendations that you take away, or like other findings from your study that might help to formulate policy recommendation towards the future?
I think the core recommendations really were in terms of this thinking more carefully about regulation and thinking ahead of time. While this field moves very fast and sometimes people feel, well, we can't regulate efficiently enough because every couple of months it's all quite new, but we can establish the basic principles like data scarcity that Fabian mentioned. We don't need to know which exact technology will be available to just have this principle that we start with giving as little data as possible, and access to more data needs to be very strongly justified, and certain data should not be given away unless, I'm not sure in which, but in a very strict conditions. Some other points that unpaid work automation might raise, one of the things that we thought about was access inequality. And this is a question, if this technology is available, but it is quite expensive, what we'll see is that middle class and richer households will be able to afford it and others will not. And we actually already have that inequality. If we look at by household income at the sort of how much time is spent on unpaid domestic labor, poorer households spend more time. And of course, time spent on unpaid domestic labor cannot be spent on something else. It means lower potential earnings, lower pensions, and there are consequences to time spent that way. It's not to say that this time is worthless or that this time should be ignored and we should just try to get rid of it, because it's not about only cleaning the floors, it's about raising our children as well. We might want to invest that time, but it's about thinking about it. And coming back to policy and to access inequality, if these robots come at significant cost, whether we need to regulate it, whether they need to be subsidized for, say, for the elderly households or for certain types of households. And if not only thinking about robots, but if we start introducing algorithms into state-provided care again, there is a question to policymakers about how much we need to ensure access equality for these once these technologies become available.
Fabian, I don't know if you want to add something on those recommendations before we close, because we are running short of time, unfortunately, even though we could go on for hours discussing these things.
I'd be really curious to hear more on how Japanese men think how difficult it is to iron bed sheets and things like that, because I think apparently they're massively overestimating this. But though the bed sheets are difficult. No, I mean, the interesting thing that I'll take away from this as well is that maybe the discussion about the automation of domestic work raises our awareness that this is productive work. It might not be paid, but it has to do... that people invest their resources, they invest time and effort in this. And maybe through the lens of automation, we start to actually measure this and make it visible, because unfortunately, much of this has been invisible in the past and often, on the back of women. And maybe this is a chance also for us to kind of advance our perception about domestic work and really see that this is work, just like paid work.
Mm. And very valuable work as well. Like when we think about risks associated with giving that work away to technology or to technology behind which there's profit-making entities, I think we become very sensitive to the risks and to sort of desire that children are raised in certain ways and adults receive certain levels of care. So I think it's invisibility of unpaid domestic labor, but it's also often like the low value put on it. And perhaps these debates can bring it more to the attention how important and how valuable it actually is.
But also, if I may echo what Fabian just said, but to a certain extent, there is a blurring line, right, between what we consider paid and unpaid work. First, you could criticize this division all in all, because the fact that it's happening within the household and not in a company or a shop has been a motive from 100 and something years. Like back 200 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, you wouldn't have this basically division of work within, work outside. So it's something that has been created in our society and our system. So one thing is about blurring the lines, about considering like more on a philosophical level, what is work, and obviously all debates around automation of work brings back this more like broader philosophical question about what actually is work on one side. And then on the other side is also, it seems to me that there is, and perhaps this is worth a research in itself or a podcast episode in itself, is the fact that this automation of domestic work brings, obviously, domestic appliances are already a consumer market, right? So we're not completely saying something that doesn't exist at all, but it disrupts this market completely, as it has been for other things. And basically, I will argue that it brings once again the household within the market sphere, which has been somehow separated from the market sphere. If you see, it's like these two ways around of blurring the lines. One is like considering these also work and like trying to make it more equal, and also when it comes to gender and so on, like recognizing that this work and so on. But on the other side, also the fact that you see that this is yet again an enlargement of the market sphere within the private, intangible private sphere, which we've seen, for example, with the digital economy that has been creating new markets where they didn't exist before. That was my Marxist. That was my Marxist.
I mean, yeah. If you look at the various developments unfolding right now, also when it comes to remote work or platform work, I think these lines, these borders, I expect them to get more and more blurred in the future. Well, is work happening in a factory, in an office, at home? Is it paid? Is it unpaid? Will a robot do it? And while there have been clear distinctions, I think until like 20, 30 years ago, they tend to disappear.
Hey, Caterina, maybe your last word on these final things.
On the blurring of the distinctions.
Yes.
I mean, I was more sort of actually thinking about what you said about the market coming into the home. And I think that's another very important point in these. We had domestic appliances before, but in the past, they were quite passive in a way. Like if you buy a washing machine, it's in your home. You are the one who's fully in control of it. Nobody else has access to it in a way. Whereas these days, with the Internet of Things, once you bring this device home, it potentially still communicates. So it's yours, but it also has this master, which gathers information through it, and so on. And that is another way of, like, a new way with which this technology now can come into private homes that they couldn't before. And something that we probably should pay more attention to and think about and study more.
Indeed. So this just means, Ekaterina, that you have still a lot of open questions to research on, and that your research is really groundbreaking and actually opening a new ways and very important with very important implications for consumers, for regulators, and of course for industry. So let's keep monitoring your progresses over there, and definitely this is not something that we will stop to discuss here at the Sound of Economics and at Bruegel. I would like then to thank both of you for joining us today. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for this episode. And I would like to remind our listeners that, as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Caterina, Fabian, thanks a lot once again, and thanks to our listeners for following us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you.